Quantum and a New Age of Espionage. For this next session, prepare to have your mind blown. From busting open sensitive encryption to creating new unbreakable codes, quantum technologies have the potential to transform the world of espionage and cryptography. A government official and physicist, a former CIA officer now operating in industry, a Stanford professor join forces to explain why and how some of these new technologies are related to things in orbit above us. Please welcome Herbert Lin, Senior Research Scholar, Hank Holland Fellow, Stanford University, Laura Thomas, Chief of Staff and Strategic Initiatives at Inflection, Andrew Wilson, Quantum Physics Division Chief, National Institute of Standards and Technology, and leading this discussion is Aerospace Corporation's very own Vice President and Chief Technology Officer, Dr. Deborah Emmons. Over to you.
Thank you, and good morning. Again, I'm Deborah Emmons, and I'm the Chief Technology Officer and Vice President at the Aerospace Corporation, where we operate the only federally funded research and development center dedicated to the space enterprise exclusively. So I'm really excited here to be here this morning and leading this group here and talking about quantum technologies, specifically their applications in space and how they may be transforming things as far as the potential in the world of espionage and cryptography. So again, I'm pleased to be joined here by a distinguished panel of experts, and let me also say a little bit more about each one of them. Dr. Herb Lin is a senior research scholar for cyber policy and security at Stanford University. Laura Thomas is the chief of staff at a quantum company, Inflection. Laura is also a former United States Central Intelligence Agency case officer. And Dr. Andrew Wilson is the chief of the National Institute of Standards and Technology Quantum Physics Division and the lead for Quantum Information Science program at NIST. So let's get started here. So we're certainly starting to hear more and more about quantum technologies, whether they be applied to sensing or communications or computing. So I'm going to start with you, Andrew. Let's talk a little bit about the advantages of quantum versus, classical technologies. How does that look?
Yeah, sure. I mean, classical technologies fundamentally rely on binary, on ones and zeros. Quantum mechanics introduces a new type of mathematics that can be used as a resource. So in quantum physics, there are things like superposition or entanglement that that can be used as a resource for information processing. So, for example, there are some problems in computing for which these two things, superposition and entanglement, enable you to do computing that you just simply can't do even on the best high-performance classical computer. And so, that's the advantage in computing. In sensing, there are some quantum states, things like squeeze states, and I mentioned entanglement before, that give you a measurement advantage. So you can measure things more precisely than you could with classical systems. In the end, quantum is the thing that actually limits the precision of measurement, which is, of course, why NIST is involved in that. And then there's the issue of security of information. And so these quantum states can be used to provide a very high degree of security of information to make it such that the information can't be accessed without disrupting the information. And so that's really the kind of fundamental ideas behind. And so those are the three areas: computing, sensing, communications, and networking.
Okay, great. So let me think about, so the end state here, again, you said for computing, it's about complexity and speed. For sensing, it's about, precision and sensitivity in the measurements. And then, of course, on the security side for the communications. So maybe, Herb, what do you think about what's more promising, one of those versus the other? Let's talk about the promise.
Well, from my perspective, Andrew mentioned the computing, the communications, and the sensing. The sensing is where, as far as I can tell, most of the action is. That's where you'll get near-term applications, sensors that are more sensitive than anything that we have now, by maybe 1 or 2 orders of magnitude, perhaps. And there's some really good near-term work in that. On quantum computing, we'll talk about that later, but from what I've been able to tell right now, there aren't any really good problems. By good problems, I mean problems that people really need to be solving in the commercial world that absolutely require quantum computing. So I mean, there are possibilities for that, but we don't know what those. We can't point to saying this is a problem that we need a quantum computer for that you couldn't do with classical computing. And then in terms of the quantum communications part, mostly that has to do with security of communications. And I would submit that with current public key infrastructure and so on, we already know how to do secure communications pretty well. And so quantum communications might give you a little bit of an edge up, but from my perspective, it doesn't. It's an expensive way to solve a problem that we already know how to solve relatively cheaply.
So can I infer from that you think maybe outside of quantum sensing, where there's more problem applications, that it's a little bit overhyped in the other areas?
Yeah, it's a little overhyped. Yes, I think I would agree with that.
I don't know. How about other panelists? Anything there? Maybe Laura. Look, you've worked on the government side. You currently work the chief of staff in commercial. What do you see the applications there?
I mean, look, the application space is as vast as it is important. I mean, we're talking about going essentially from candlelight to electricity. And when you think about the current challenges we have in the world today, you think about the rise of authoritarianism, the focus that we've had on software, when we really need to be getting back to doing hard things again. Quantum is one of those definitional platform shift technologies. And this race that we're in right now, especially with the Chinese government, I mean, technology is at the heart of it, and quantum, I think, is even at the heart of that. And back to the point on sensing, sensing is the near term, here and now. It can interact with the current systems we have today, provide speed ups that are 1,000x times faster, and it's ready to be commercialized.
Anything you want to add on that, Ern?
That last statement I certainly agree with. And in terms of the vast space of quantum computing that's possible that you alluded to, I agree with that too. But we're still mucking around in it. We're still exploring that space to identify the relevant problems that people need to be solving. Yeah.
And there are problems along the way that we can solve through sensors that I think add to our understanding of building better quantum computers.
Okay. So, one of the things at aerospace, we are certainly being asked now, our physical science laboratories, to work more and begin to look more at quantum sensing. That's probably the area that we are working the most in, whether it's atomic clock performance and their characterization and drift over time. The other thing that's, again, kind of as we operate more in this commercial space, government's asked us to kind of look at the landscape, look at what's happening in some of the commercial companies, and then sort of see, can these ground demos actually make their way to space? And so I think the big question with some of these is, can we see this insertion of these capabilities, technologies into space applications? So, I think maybe one of the things I'd like to talk about here now is a little bit more on the challenges side, and what do you guys see, maybe starting here with you, Laura, on the, what are the challenges? What's going to hold us up here on this pathway?
Two huge challenges. First is talent. Just having the workforce that's ready to take something that's, absolutely there from a research standpoint. We have prototypes. They work wonderfully. They even work in field demonstrations. But then taking that and productizing it. How do you build something repeatably at scale? Because if we don't start building at scale, we're never going to hit that cost curve that we need to truly commercialize the technology. So workforce is one of the first challenges. Second is supply chain. A lot of the parts and pieces that go into building this technology, they're not here in the United States. It's not quick to order some of these devices. We have to figure out how to onshore this, vertically integrate it, in order to hit those economies of scale as well.
So how about you, Andrew? Where do you see the challenges and the concerns here?
Yeah, well, I agree with Laura that these are two enormous challenges. I mean, fundamentally, these ideas of using quantum as a resource, this entanglement and superposition that I talked about is great, but the difficulty with it is that quantum systems are generally very fragile. And that's actually part of the reason why they're an advantage, perhaps, for sensing. They're affected by things. And so that means that there are enormous engineering challenges associated with actually bringing these things to deployment. And so I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done along that area. I would say that while that's a challenge, it's also an opportunity. It's likely that there are going to need to be substantial breakthroughs that are really needed in order for the sort of the dream, if you like, of quantum to come through. And so that's an opportunity for startup companies, for people to inject new ideas.
So maybe picking up on that, why don't you go,
Well,
yeah.
Let me give an analogy which, at least to me, helps to clarify sort of the nature of the leaps that you might want to take. Okay, you've said, and I agree, that both of you said that in some sense, the basic technology, we sort of understand what that's about, and we can make sort of rudimentary quantum computing work in various scenarios and so on. And that's absolutely true. But let me pose, for a space audience, let me pose to you two problems, okay? Problem number one is, right now, there's no feasible way to get to Mars with a crewed mission. Problem number two is, there's no feasible way to get to Pluto with a crewed mission, okay? I submit to you that both of those are impossible right now, but they're different kinds of impossible. We are, I mean, the engineering, it's just in engineering, it's just a small matter of engineering in both cases. Well, not so small, and you need the breakthroughs to get, to get to what you need to do to go to Pluto, maybe even to Mars. And we can get to the moon now, sort of. I mean, nobody can get to the moon reliably right now in any case, but that's closer. Different kinds of impossibility, and I think that, from my standpoint, there's a lot of the discussion about quantum computing in particular that is more like going to Pluto than it is than going to Mars.
So I'm going to pick up on couple of things here that we were talking about, both on the talent side and maybe a little bit, we talked about some opportunities for startups. So let's start with the startups here. Now we know this is it's capital extensive, and that's a big expense here for startups. So again, maybe Laura, can you talk a little bit about, from a startup standpoint, what that looks like, and then maybe a little bit more about the problem set that you're actually working on at Inflection?
Yeah, if you're an entrepreneur and you're looking to get into the quantum world, specifically in the hardware, good luck. This is one of the most expensive, capital-intensive industries that you could possibly become involved in. There's deep tech and then there's quantum. And this is hard. And on the software side, it's a little different. But yet, a lot of the quantum software companies, you're building software for hardware that doesn't really exist. I mean, that's kind of like building DOS before the computer. So one challenge we have is, especially in the United States, I guess it's global, we've got what we call the 600 little company challenge. Now, maybe there's not exactly 600 little startups in quantum, but there's so many, and they're so fractured, and they're not all working in tandem towards this bigger sort of picture. And that's where we do need some big industry consolidators to come in when you start thinking about the scale challenges and the financial challenges.
So you're seeing maybe that we would need some kind of consortium or some kind of group together working?
Well, not a consortium.
Okay.
Consortiums are great for many things, but they're also ripe for, basically everybody gets a trophy, we're all trying to work together, but yet we actually have different end states and goals. So I think companies that are going to consolidate and vertically integrate, and that we're going to see that in the quantum space more and more.
Okay, more on that side. How about on the talent side? You had mentioned also that one of the biggest challenges when we were talking about challenges was on the talent dimension. You all representing different perspectives here, both from both in industry and government and academia. What are you seeing on the talent side that you said that was a challenge? How do we solve that? Andrew, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I think initially, as this industry began, it began small, and it was focused around physics and around quantum physics and people with PhDs. But as the activities have grown, and they've grown really rapidly, then what's really needed is a much more diverse workforce. There are a lot more different activities that have to come together in order for these companies to succeed beyond just straight quantum physics. So I think understanding where the opportunities are, that's a hard thing. But then I think the other part is just simply, you know, maybe contradicting what I'm saying, but when you come back to the quantum physics, there's a limited number of opportunities for really creating large numbers of people with expertise in this area. So I think there are activities that are going on to try and make improvements to that. So in other words, to form, one example is to form research collaborations between institutions that have traditionally not necessarily been very strong in quantum with those that are. So this is a way of really trying to juice the pipeline, if you like.
Yes, so maybe, you know, Andrew, that makes a lot of sense, and you know, certainly one of the things I think you think about with quantum is that everybody needs a PhD in quantum physics. So maybe, you know, back to you, Laura, and then we can talk a little bit about what do you think? Is that's what's needed here, or how do we really open up this workforce?
We have a number of researchers. We always need more. I mean, AMO physicists are not that easy to come by. But when you're talking about building devices at scale, you need technicians, and you need people who are willing to do, you know, the hard work of building the same thing over and over again. And that's usually not what physicists like to do, at least in the experience at my company. So finding the workforce that's willing to, you know, do document control and just put in the day-to-day grind of, I'm building the same exact optical clock over and over again.
Anything from you, Herb?
Well, we were talking about it a little bit before backstage. I mean, it's the idea that disciplinary expertise in academia is highly valued, and systems integration experience and expertise is less valued. And I heard a lot of what was said here as being consistent with yes, we need the subject, the physics expertise and so on, but you need people who understand how to build systems in a reliable way and consistently to make progress, and that's really, really, really hard.
Right. Okay, so maybe I'm going to turn over to Andrew and ask a little bit more about some of the work going on at the National Institute in Standards and Technology with something called post-quantum cryptography. I know you guys have been leading the way on the standards there. Can you talk about that?
Sure. Yeah, no, happy to talk about that. So, the early drivers decades ago of government interest in quantum was driven by the intelligence community. Shor's algorithm, which some of you may have heard of, was an algorithm that effectively meant that if a quantum supercomputer, if you like, that would be one way to describe it, could actually be built, and that would basically be able to break public key encryption. So if such a computer existed today, that would create a cryptography crisis. It doesn't exist today. The intelligence community funded research essentially to ask the question, could this be built? I think the physicists have concluded, yes, it can be built. There aren't fundamental reasons why such a device could not be constructed. And the challenges are, how do you actually do that? There are many different technologies that are being worked on. It's hard to know whether there will be a single winner in the technology in this area. So in the meantime, we need to prepare. So at the moment, NIST is working on a post-quantum cryptography program, which essentially is an international effort to generate a standard that could be applied to cryptography to make it resistant to attack from such a computer. And that standard, there are draft versions of standards that are out already. It's an ongoing process, and the challenge will then be to implement these standards in a practical way. That is an enormous challenge because there are a huge number of systems that would need to implement these systems. And so NIST is working on that, coordinating, as I said, an international effort on this.
Yeah, so maybe picking up on that, certainly when we talk about standards, sometimes it can be very challenging there to get that adoption, and sometimes there's that resistance to say, can everybody want to pick them up, or do we wait and see where industry's going? So What's your thoughts on the timeline, and what is this going to look like and then making sure that you're getting really that input? I think earlier this year you had an RFI out, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I think everyone has their opinions. I have an opinion. The usual answer you get from physicists like me is, well, it's at least 10 years out. That's what we've been saying for a number of 10 years. And so you can use that as a judgment to decide how serious these things are. I think it's very hard to tell because, as I said, there are many different technologies that are being pursued. There's an enormous efforts that are being made in these areas. Progress is very rapid. But again, there's a lot of fundamental science that goes into actually implementing this stuff. So it's actually extremely hard to work on the timeline. Of course, the timeline for post-quantum cryptography is basically dominated by the timeline for large-scale quantum computing as well. So it's really hard to say. Do I think that there's going to be a large-scale quantum computer in the next 2 years? No. Is there going to be one in 5 years? Well, some of my industry collaborators might say, well, you know, we're going to have something pretty interesting in 5 years. I think it's going to be a lot longer, but I think maybe in my mind, the reason why I think it's going to be longer is I think that, you know, the true dream, for at least for quantum computing, is fault-tolerant computers that can really deal with the kind of errors that occur in quantum systems that you don't get in classical computing. That's much harder. Those systems are, they require enormous technical overhead. So I think, you know, when I think about the timeline, that's what I'm thinking about. Fault-tolerant, large-scale quantum computers, that's going to be some time away, I think.
Right. I mean, I think there was some opening discussion around the problem sets and the timelines there. So maybe, Herb, do you have anything to talk about here with regards to the timelines from your line of work here at Stanford? I mean, what are you seeing? What do you think is going to be emergent in the next couple of years?
Well, not something that's a problem for the next couple of years, but at least government agencies ought to be thinking about it starting to think about it in the next couple of years. However long you think it's going to take for Shor's algorithm to be implementable, I mean, X years from now, whatever X is, right now, the intelligence community would be willing to bet a large amount that there's a lot of encrypted traffic out there that has been recorded that is currently not decipherable, that you can't decrypt. There are troves and troves and troves of recorded data, of recorded encrypted data that people recorded, that adversaries recorded at some point in the hope that they might someday be decryptable. And X years from now, they will be, sort of by definition. And so there's an interesting question there about all the secrets that we had that once we thought were going to be secure, that in fact all of our adversaries are going to get a hold of in X years or X plus 5 years or something like that. That's a really interesting policy problem. I don't know of any US government agency that's thought about that part of it. And it's going to happen. It's going to be a massive leak. And how is that going to affect US foreign policy and our relations with allies and adversaries and all that sort of stuff? And I think the answer is nobody knows. No government officials actually paid attention to that problem, as far as I can tell.
There's definitely starting to. I can certainly attest. I used to run assets for the CIA, and that means recruiting people in place to spy. And writing up reports from them, absolutely the question that I had for the technical teams was, at what point will this become decipherable, specifically from China? Because this person's life is on the line, and I really care about that from an ethical standpoint, but also no asset's going to volunteer to work for CIA if they think they're going to get arrested. And absolutely to your point, we know the Chinese CCP is sucking up massive amounts of data. It's still now decrypt later. When is that 0 day that a quantum computer sufficiently powerful enough exists that they can do it? And as soon as they get the capability, quite confident they're going to use it.
Maybe I'll just jump in here. I mean, there is an acute awareness of this problem, of course, and the question is, okay, to what extent can you do something about this particular problem? The information that's stored probably has a use-by date or its usefulness decays over time. I think the people that are deeply concerned about this problem in the intelligence community, the solution for them is to get these post-quantum cryptography standards implemented on their critical systems as soon as they possibly can, and I can assure you that they're working very hard on that problem.
So again, you know, some of these applications and technologies are a little more advanced, again, along the technology readiness levels here. And you've talked about applications here with the intelligence community. Laura, maybe can you talk a little bit more about your products and customers?
Sure. I mean, primarily focused on defense and security because the governments have the ability to shoulder the burden of larger size systems at higher cost. But ultimately, it's all driven towards commercial markets, and that's hitting that economies of scale cost curves, dropping the price, dropping the size. First item is optical atomic clocks. This is absolutely critical for position, navigation, and timing, which is something Department of Defense and other governments around the world care very much about. If our satellite capability would be taken out, or is taken out, or spoofed, hacked, denied, how are we going to navigate? Logistics is what wins wars. If we don't know where our troops are, we can't effectively fight. For the commercial markets, though, it's about data density. When you can increase precision and timing, you're not just selling a clock. You're actually selling time and the fabric of time. You can speed up data throughput through networks. And when you think about ChatGPT, it is completely breaking servers right now. We can't continue that, that trajectory. But if you can speed up the data throughput via accurate timing stamps, huge commercial market.
So that's a place where we're maybe missing out now if we can't scale this. Yeah. So maybe let's talk a little bit about where we stand here, in the U.S. and versus globally. Maybe can you let's talk about what's been happening. I mean, certainly there's been a lot in the news in terms of, investments being made, whether it's in VC or in governments. Where do we stand there, and where are you seeing other developments here? Maybe, Andrew, you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, quantum's certainly a global activity. Throughout the world, there are many fantastic research groups that have been making breakthroughs for decades. And so that investment in other parts of the world pays off over time. And so indeed, it's a global effort. So the competition is incredibly diverse and incredibly intense. Assessment on the US side, United States has a very, very strong quantum programs. I think if you try and decide, okay, who's in the lead in certain areas, I think different countries have different styles and different approaches to what they're doing. And so maybe you might argue that there are some areas where the United States doesn't lead. And that's a serious concern. I think on the quantum computing side, there's just an enormous amount of activity in the research environments and government labs and academia and so forth, and the vast majority of companies, which is really where the research and development is really now being led in quantum computing. It's more on the commercial side rather than in academia. That's heavily in the United States. So there's an awful lot of strength. And of course, being in San Francisco now, the tech home, a lot of the real innovation and drive is coming from this part of the country.
Yes. And where are you seeing maybe the biggest partners? You did talk about post-quantum cryptography as being an international effort, or having international involvement. Maybe where are you seeing some of the partnerships and collaboration opportunities?
Well, I think standards are, post-quantum cryptography is a standards operation. And when you do standards, you really need buy-in from everybody. So for that kind of work, it's really important to have strong relationships throughout the world and to work together. In other areas, it's a much more competitive environment. And so I think that there are certain parts of the world that is easier for us to interact with. I think what we try and do is establish trusted networks. That's how I would describe it, where the flow of information, where it needs to flow, is able to flow. And in some areas, it just simply can't. And then the other part is, as Laura mentioned, is workforce. We want to be able to take advantage of the best and brightest. And that means being able to have a movement of people.
Okay. And how about you, Herb?
I'm going to pass on that.
All right. And anything else there?
The way the U.S. has traditionally projected power is through setting technology standards and being the leader. And yes, we're in the lead, arguably, with quantum, Maybe not on the quantum communication side if you think about, satellite activity, maybe. But that gap is narrowing, and that's what concerns me. When you look at the patents that are being filed in China specifically, the amount of IP theft that's happening out of China, it's very concerning. And I fear that the US is losing a lead and that it will not be able to set technology standards that keep totalitarianism at bay.
Well, on that note, that's pretty heavy, but understand. And anything else here, just closing
yes,
here?
Well, just, in terms of the three levels of effort that we're doing, the quantum computing, communications, and sensing, I mean, the first and the third are, from my standpoint, absolutely worth the money we're spending on that. There's no question about that. And my level of effort that I want to put into quantum communications is just enough, is a level such that it's enough to convince the Chinese to spend their 10 to 100 times as much as we do on it. That would be a great outcome from the US standpoint.
Well, very good. This was really exciting. A lot of exciting things here in quantum in the new age of espionage. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.